everyone, and welcome to your Arlington Dollar. I am James Milan. We are here in the hearing room at Town Hall with a familiar face, especially at around this time of year. We are talking in early January, and we're talking to our Deputy Town Manager, Sandy Pooler, who is self-described. He's the money guy within the Town Manager's office, and we are here to talk about where we are at this point in the budget cycle for this year, and about the long-range planning numbers that have just come out recently, and we'll dig into those a little bit more completely over the course of our conversation. But first of all, Sandy, thanks very much for being here.
Thank you, James. Glad to be here.
We always appreciate you taking the time, and would like to ask you to actually revisit a topic that you've talked to us about before, and that is just giving us an overview of what the town's budget process is and where we stand right now as of early January in that process.
Sure, I'm glad to. Well, we have an annual budget cycle. The town budget starts every year in July 1st based on what the previous spring's town meeting has voted. So we came out of last spring with our FY19 budget. You always know what fiscal year you're in because it's the year of the next June. And we are in the beginning stages of the FY20 budget cycle. So we're putting together the budget that will be presented at the town meeting this coming spring, and working to present a balanced budget. The town charter requires that the town manager present a budget to the select board and to the finance committee by January 15th every year. And then both the select board and the finance committee have several months to review those budgets, to talk to the department heads, to make whatever adjustments they feel necessary, and then present the reports to town meeting. But really this process started in the fall, where we looked at the results of the previous fiscal year to see what our revenue collections and spending patterns were. And then we start meetings with the long-range planning committee and review all of those things and make some forecasts about where things are going for the coming year.
So let me ask you, when you mentioned the long-range planning committee, what is the composition of that group?
So there are a couple of members, each from the select board, the finance committee, and the school committee. In addition, there are various staff: the town treasurer, comptroller, town manager, deputy town manager, the school business manager comes, and they're open public meetings. Anybody can attend, but that group is really there to come together and share information and report back what they learn to their home boards, and help those boards decide in their budget deliberations what sort of things they're going to ask for, or what they think is realistic that they can count on to spend. So it's a group that works by consensus. It doesn't vote, but it exchanges information and tries to come to a common understanding of the town's financial position.
Yeah, and I can see that there are representatives from every kind of major constituency in town, certainly everyone that will require a certain amount of funding, et cetera. And that makes sense. But it's the long-range planning committee. So what does that mean, long-range?
So every year, as part of the manager's budget and the finance committee report to town meeting, we publish a long-range plan. It's a 5-year plan. It includes the current year's budget, the year that we're in. So this plan will have where we are in the FY19 budget as voted by town meeting, and then a forecast for the coming budget, FY20 through 24. And within that, a breakdown of our estimated revenue and our estimated expenditures. And
as you said, those are estimates. And my understanding is that this long-range planning committee and process it's no longer new for Arlington, but it has not always been the case here. Tell us just a little bit about how long it's been around, what the use of it is, and how it is that those estimates, which must be revised every year, right, as the reality kind of, as you have to balance that with the reality of the results.
Right.
How useful a mechanism has this turned out to be?
So I think Arlington has been a real leader across the state. A lot of people look to Arlington as an example of doing good long-term planning, and some people even refer to what we do here in town as the Arlington Plan. It really all started before the first operating override the town had in the mid-2000s, 2005, 2006. And I think there was a realization that the town, like most cities and towns in the state, had a structural deficit, that the amounts that we could raise every year from property taxes weren't keeping pace with the cost of providing the sort of services that people expect. So they put together a long-range planning committee to look at what the long-term trends were, understand the drivers for costs and the drivers behind revenue, and to come up with a plan centered around having an override that would be big enough in the first year to cover the next year's gap and then some. So sort of put aside money in the fat years, so to speak, so that when the lean years come, you can draw that money down. So it's basically, the Arlington Plan means that you're creating sort of a savings account after you have an override. So any excess money goes into the savings account. You kind of live off of that for a few years. At some point, it will run out again. You'll have to go back to the voters for another override. And having a long-range forecast is essential to that whole plan, because in any one year, you need to know where you stand relative to that override plan. And if you're going to make decisions about spending, whether you're going to increase spending or keep on pace with the level of spending you've had in the past, you want to see how that rolls out into the future. And that's exactly what this plan does.
And you mentioned that it's referred to as the Arlington Plan in some circles, and that Arlington, in a sense, is a model for other towns and cities in the state. How unusual is it to have a long-range planning committee and a long-range plan? Is it still more rare than common, or do most cities and towns in Massachusetts try and do something like this at this point?
There are 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts. I would say there are a lot more communities do it now than had in the past. However, it tends to be the larger, better organized communities. I mean, there are a lot of small hill towns out in Western Mass and so forth that just don't have the capacity to do it. So I think I'd say kind of, the Arlingtons or Lexingtons or Cambridge type of communities are doing it. I can't speak for some of the others that may not have the capacity.
Mm-hmm. You had mentioned when you were describing both the genesis of the long-range planning committee and the usefulness of the numbers and the report that it generates. You did mention that the precipitating factor was a structural override in the mid-2000s, and anybody who is watching us, I think, is aware that as we sit here on early January of 2019, what is looming for the town is a vote to come, either most likely this spring, I believe, about whether to approve a structural extra funding to address this structural deficit. And of course the debt exclusion to pay for the high school. I know that is on everyone's minds, and we are going to be digging deeper into the numbers in this report shortly, but I did want to acknowledge that people will not find any addressing specifically, either estimating or otherwise, around the override and the debt exclusion in these numbers. That's just a separate thing.
What the long-range plan will tell us is how much the gap between our revenues and our expenditures will be in the future. We know that by FY22, we will be in deficit, about $5.5 million, and then it gets substantially bigger after that. What we do about that in terms of how big an override we have and when we have the override, which will play into how big it gets, is something that the select board will have to make a decision about probably later this month or early next month. Really the dynamic there is if we do an override this spring, we can do a smaller one and sort of bank that money the way I talked about in the Arlington plan before, so that we can get through 3, 4, or 5 years without having to think about another override again. If we wait longer than that, we can still follow the Arlington plan model, but the effect of losing a year of saving money will be that you have to have a much bigger override a year later. Mm-hmm. So that is, I think, some of the trade-offs that the select board is going to have to decide about.
And I just want to remind our audience that in fact what you've just described is something that has been going on for the last number of years, by which I mean the last override was in 2011, and at that point it was forecast to cover, 3 years or so, mm-hmm. and for a variety of factors discussed on this show with a number of actors here in Arlington, it has managed to be extended all the way, 7, 8 years. Yeah. And so, again, it's never good news that we have to, deal with a structural override, but you have to acknowledge that it has been a very well managed, that the town has been very well managed fiscally since the last override. So we can afford to believe that that will continue to be the case coming up. Well, that I think suffices, unless you have anything that you think we should add into the conversation, which again is just basically giving people the sense of where we're at and where we're going.
So I would just say in terms of the calendar and the process is the Long-Range Planning Committee has been meeting monthly throughout the fall and has each month come up with an updated version of this long-range plan as new information comes in. New information about what, for example, based on what our collections have been in the past year, or beginning of October, we learned about what our certified number for school enrollment has been, so that's changed from an estimate to an actual number. We will have a new version of this for January 15th. Within 2 weeks of that, the governor's budget will come out. We will get new revised numbers about what local aid is likely to be. We will then revise the long-range plan again so that we'll have an up-to-date one for the Long-Range Planning Committee to discuss. Then by the time we get to town meeting, we will also have information about our final health insurance rates, which are another big driver of the plan. And we will have information about the budget that has gone from the governor's budget to the budget that the House Ways and Means Committee is going to recommend. So one thing about forecasts is they're always changing. And so there are several iterations of this. We will be posting these things on the town website. People will be able to see them under our budget and finance page. But forecasting never ends.
Yeah. So what I hear you saying definitely is that these numbers are in flux, as you say. This is a dynamic process which changes as new information comes in all the time and is then adopted and adapted into these numbers. And so as we move into the next part of our conversation where we're going to dig down into them, I think it's worth reminding people that not to focus on the specific numbers themselves, which might change, but to look at the trends and to be able to just identify the different components of our budget as presented in these numbers. And again, not to be too wedded to the specifics, because those can always change.
Absolutely right.
All right. Well, without further ado, why don't we start taking a harder look at what we can see on this sheet.
Great.
Okay, so here we are with the long-range financial projection in front of us. Why don't you just explain what it is that we're looking at?
This is the town's long-range financial plan. We break it down into 5 big components. One is revenue, which is at the top here. Then we have school-related expenses, town-related expenses, the capital budget, and then everything else. So we start at the top with revenue because we still are very much a revenue-driven budget process. And I can just go through what some of the major components of the revenue budget are. The first one up here is state aid. So for FY20, we're estimating about $20 million in state aid. And that comes principally from education aid, Chapter 70 aid, and unrestricted general government aid, and then a few smaller things.
And just to give people a sense, that's 20 million out of a total budget of close to 170 million.
That's right.
So we're getting about 12%, 10% or so of our total revenues.
The next one here is school construction aid, which is a small number, and eventually you'll see it goes to 0. It is some money that the state gave us for some old capital projects that we're still paying some bonds off on, that the state had a contribution. But as I say, that is small and it's going to go away. The next big thing is local receipts. And that is the whole array of local fees and fines, and most particularly the motor vehicle excise tax, which is our largest local receipt. And as part of the long-range plan, what we have done every year is made estimates of what we're going to get in. In FY20, you can see, because of some intense conversations on the long-range planning committee, we looked at how much we were really bringing in versus what we had estimated. And we decided to increase our local receipts by $700,000 in FY20. Going forward, we're increasing it by $100,000 a year, and that's been the usual pattern. But this year, we looked at what we had brought in over the last few years, saw a consistent enough trend, so we boosted that. The next thing is free cash. Free cash is another name for our operating surplus. At the end of the year, we take the difference between how much we've estimated we're going to spend and what we really spent, and we always spend less than what we've estimated, and how much we've brought in revenue versus what we estimated, and we always bring in more revenue than we've estimated. And that surplus becomes free cash. And our policy is that every year we take half of the amount of free cash we have from the previous year and we put it into the operating budget. And then into the future, we look at a 10-year average of what that free cash has been, and we take 50% of that 10-year average. And just so you see on this sheet, you can see that these numbers have gone up a little in the last couple of years. That's because down here at the bottom, you can see what our actual free cash was, $11 million, certified by the state at the end of fiscal year 18. Half of that is the 5.5 million, and then our 10-year average goes out like this.
Let me just interrupt you for a second. You were saying as part of your explanation just now that we always estimate less revenue than we take in, and we always estimate more expenses than we in fact make. Why is that, and what is the goal or purpose or usefulness of that?
Well, on the revenue side, you want to be conservative because you never want to get out ahead of yourself on your revenue estimates. You never want to get into a position where you have been overly optimistic about revenue and then fail to meet those revenue numbers, and then you can't pay your bills or pay your people. So that's pretty much a disaster. And it's just bad fiscal management, plus the state gets mad at you if you do things like that. So we really want to avoid that. On the expense side, what we do is we fully budget for, say, all our positions. Let's say, for example, the police department. Assume that we have about 100 police officers. And we assume from the beginning of the year that they're all going to be there working all year. Now, during the year, a police officer may retire, in which case you don't have to pay that full salary for the year. If the police officer retires, you also get savings sometimes in health insurance. So that happens particularly in the big departments, police, fire, and public works. There's always a certain amount of turnover. You want to budget the full amount because you don't necessarily know ahead of time who will retire or who will leave to take another job, so you want to make sure the money's there. But there's always a certain number of turnbacks that come because of vacancies and things like that.
Thank you.
All right, the next one is something called overlay reserve surplus, which is only $200,000 a year, and it's a very small amount of money that we get from the assessors, and it basically gets sort of cycled back to them so they can help do their annual revaluations. It's a pretty insignificant number. What is the big number and the driving force between every city and town's budget in the state is property taxes. $127 million estimated for FY 2020. That number, as you can see, is estimated to go up by about $3.6 million, or a 2.96% increase. And that increase is because we have our normal 2.5% increase plus a certain amount for new growth. So it gets you a little bit more than 2.5.
So that number will always be at least 2.5% and a little bit more than that because there's other stuff to be taken into account in addition to the 2.5% rise.
Absolutely. The last item here is something that is, I would say, it used to be unique to Arlington, but now other communities have started to copy the Arlington plan, and that is an override stabilization fund. When we've had an override in the past, we've had overrides that have brought in sufficiently more money for a couple of years after the override that we've put the excess into the override stabilization fund. We do that so that you don't have to have an override every single year. And so we built up an override stabilization fund to, last year it hit $23 million. And then we started to take money out. FY19 was the first time in 6 years that we took money out of the override stabilization fund. Then we'll take more out in FY 2020. Then we take another $10 million out the year after that. And then in 22, that is all that's left in the fund. It will totally deplete the fund. So you add up all your sources and you get an overall increase of about 4.5% in what we're going to spend this year. Again, about 4.5% in terms of revenue available. And then again, it starts to drop off pretty significantly after that. So those are revenues. Then we get into expenses. The largest part of the budget is the school operating budget, and it has three major components. General education costs. Under this plan and under the policies set by the Long Range Planning Committee, we assume that our general education costs are going to go up by 3.5% every year. Plus, we look at how much enrollment has increased from the previous year. So the previous year, our enrollment went up by 170 students. I'll explain in a second how we factor that in. We add that to the FY19 budget, and then we move that up into the FY20 base to have an increase that reflects both that 3.5% increase plus enrollment growth. Special education costs we know grow faster than other costs, and so we estimate those going up 7% a year. And then there's the growth factor. So every year we look at these numbers down at the bottom that represent our actual enrollment growth and projected enrollment growth. Those numbers are supplied to us by the school department. And we take a look at what the average cost to educate a student in Arlington is. and then we multiply the enrollment growth times 35% of the average cost. And the reason we do 35% is we know that adding one new student increases some of your cost. You're going to have to buy more books and markers and things like that. But one new student won't mean you're going to have to hire a new principal or teacher or superintendent or build a new school building. So that's why we don't add 100% of the average cost. We add a fraction. And over the years, we've sort of settled on that 35% as being the best and most reasonable expectation of what the incremental cost of a new child is. All that gets added up, and so when you factor that in, you're going to see that for FY20, there's about a 6%, a little over a 6% increase in the school budget. In future years, it's again a little under 6%, about 5.5%, a little over 5.5%, a little over 5.5%. That increase has been pretty consistent over the last few years as we've seen enrollment growing. Arlington is one of the communities that's got the highest percentage increase in enrollment of any community in the state over the last 10 years. And it has really been one of the major factors driving increase in the school budget. So
I can see, as you just pointed out, that forecasting forward, it's roughly between 5.5% to 6% or 6.5%. And you're saying that historically also, look, if we were to look back the last 5 or 10 years or something, it would look roughly the same, falling into that same range of about 5 to 6%.
That's right. Over the last 7 or 8 years, I'd say our enrollment has gone up 25%, which is, I mean, it's a big number.
That is a very dramatic number.
So that's the school budget. The next line here is for Minuteman. It's the assessment that we pay to the Minuteman Technical Vocational High School. We estimate every year that their costs are going to go up 3.25%. And then we get an actual bill from them for what those assessments are. And you can see this year, it's gone up a little bit more, 10%, and the reason it's gone up is not because their operating costs are going up, but because baked into this is the increase for debt on the new school building there. Mm-hmm. Going forward, we will estimate, I misspoke a second ago, I said 3.25%, it's 3.5% for their education costs, the same estimate that we use for our school system. Now we get into the town. So the town, our expenses include police, fire, town hall, public works, senior center, library, you know, all of the non-school town departments. We have those going up as personnel expenses and operating expenses, and we assume every year that those are going to go up by 3.25%. And when the town manager puts his budget together and works with the departments, his marching orders are to make sure that that we keep to that 3.25%. So departments may request increases, they may request more staff and such, but we have to live within that budget, and so that carries forward from year to year. There's one other line here, which is enterprise fund and other offsets, which means that some of the work that's done on the town budgets or the town departments, for example, the treasurer's office. The treasurer's office, one of the functions it does is to send out a lot of bills. It sends out tax bills, which are all general fund, town expenses. It also sends out water and sewer bills, which are an enterprise fund. And so we charge the water and sewer fund and certain other funds for some of the costs that are occurring in town government. And that number is an offset. So when you add 28 million plus 10 million, you get 38 some odd million. Then you subtract 2.5 million that the enterprise funds are paying. You get a $36.8 million increase. That's the bottom line town budget.
So before you move on, I just wanted to make note of the fact that I don't know if it's unusual or not, but it looks like our school budget numbers are about 2/3, very close to 2/3 of the overall budget. You know, almost double what we spend on the other services in town.
That's true. I think Arlington is a community that has a rapidly growing school enrollment. I think a lot of people have moved to Arlington because of the schools, and the town over the years, I mean for a long period of time, has been very supportive of the school system. So we do have a school budget that is big, absolutely.
And as we move into the capital budget, I see that we are getting our first flavor of red. So perhaps you can explain that as part of what we're looking at.
So I'm going to do one more line before we get there. I just want to say we have this line called MWRI debt shift. Arlington is one of the very few communities that does this, and the select board is looking at whether we want to continue to do it. But every year we subsidize the water and sewer rates by $5.5 million. This went into effect years ago when the MWRA first started increasing water and sewer rates dramatically. And the idea was if you shift some of those costs onto the tax rolls, which they are here, then people are able to deduct them. However, because of the changes in federal law that Congress enacted last year, with putting limits on how much we can deduct, there's no longer as much a justification for doing that. So I know the select board is looking at whether we want to continue that into the future. This number essentially acts as an override number. It is in addition to your taxes, to the baseline taxes. If we were to reduce this, that would give taxpayers a little bit of a break. It would move to the water and sewer bills, but then at that level, people have a little bit more control over things like how much water they're using. So that's going to be the discussion I know the select board has started to have and will continue to have in the next year about maybe changing that number. But now we're on to capital.
Now we're on to capital.
So there are some good red numbers on this sheet and bad red numbers on this sheet. There are three major components to capital. How much we're spending on exempt debt service. And exempt means it's exempt from Proposition 2.5. It's over and above what our regular tax levy is. It's what we call a debt exclusion. So these exempt debt numbers are the debt service we're paying for the bonds issued to build a lot of the schools that we've renovated. We've renovated basically all our elementary schools over the last 15 or more years. I think the first one was the Brackett, and the most recent one was the Thompson. And you can see here that this excluded debt goes down $100,000 and then $700,000 and then another $100,000. As we're starting to pay off the debt on those schools, the impact of those overrides will start to lessen. So that goes down. Non-exempt debt service is the regular debt service we pay for out of our regular tax levy. And what we say as a matter of policy is that 5% of the budget should go toward capital. That's a policy of the town. So that's really made up of regular debt service for other non-exempt things. So for example, when we redid the police station or the firehouses, that was non-exempt debt. And then we also spend a certain amount of cash on capital. Then there are similar offsets from water and sewer or the antenna fund or ambulance fund or so forth that helps defray some of the costs up here. That's why that's a good red number.
Good red number.
Right. And then this number comes out to about 5% of our budget every year. And it is going toward capital. And Arlington is has been quite farsighted ever since John Billiford, the treasurer years ago, came up with this idea that we should be spending 5% on capital. The town has maintained that commitment, and it's made it much easier to invest in keeping up our buildings and other infrastructure. We then have other. And others, there's some pretty significant things here. The amount we put aside for pensions every year, which by our agreement with the retirement board goes up 5.5% a year. the amount we have for insurance, the bulk of which is for health insurance for our employees and retirees. That goes up depending on how many people have enrolled in different plans. It goes up between about 5 and 6% a year. Again, very much driven by how many new students we have, which then rolls into how many teachers we have, and then rolls into that number. And then there are certain other things. The state gives us state aid, and the state takes away state assessments, the biggest of which is the assessment for the MBTA, for the transit system. Every year we have to set aside a certain amount for overlay in case people file for abatements, and if they convince the assessors that they've been overassessed on their taxes, we have to account for that and set aside amounts for refunds.
So that may or may not be used?
It may or may not be used, and in fact, we've built up a fairly significant overlay reserve, and we will be looking to ask the assessors to release some of that and put it into the plan, put it into the override stabilization fund so that we can use that for the operating budget because it has become surplus. Every year we set aside 1% of the budget in a reserve fund. That is often used in case we go over on snowstorms, if we use up all the DPW budget for snow. Sims property, we're still paying off some debt for the Sims property. That will go away in a couple of years. And there's some money in there, $100,000 every year, we put aside in case there's some last minute court judgments that we have to pay off and don't have time to go back to town meeting. And then warrant articles. Every town meeting has a warrant and has warrant articles. Arlington happens to pay for a number of things like our boards and commissions and certain commemorations, Town Day, or putting flags on graves through separate warrant articles. We also have a warrant article here for OPEB, the amount of money the other post-employment benefits, which are the health insurance benefits for our retirees. We have a trust fund. We put about $600,000 a year into OPEB, and that's reflected in that line. And then years ago, you would have seen numbers for override stabilization money for putting money into the fund these years, but we stopped doing that. Now we're taking it out.
Now it's taking money out, right.
What we really look at in this long-range plan is to make sure that in the current year that this number is zero, that we have a balanced budget. We were balanced last year, we're going to be balanced in FY20, we're going to be balanced in FY21, but by FY22, we're going to have a $4.8 million deficit. That jumps to $17 million the year thereafter, and then to $21 million and keeps getting bigger. So that's why we know under the Arlington plan, we're going to have an override before the FY22 budget. And the discussion right now is how big that override is going to be. If we have it soon, if we have it this coming spring, so that we can start putting money back into the override stabilization fund, we can have a smaller override because we'll be building up money for a couple of years. If we wait till the next year, we only have another year to put money in, and then we're going to be taking money out again. So it would be a much bigger override. That's the discussion that the Select Board is having right now. They will have to decide later this month or by the beginning of February how much to ask for an override, when to have it, and how long that override will last. Typically, overrides in Arlington have been scheduled to last anywhere from 3 to 5 years. And so that, again, is a decision of the Select Board as to how long that override will last and therefore how big it's going to be.
You just made an excellent explanation, but because this goes right to the heart of a lot of what people are thinking about at the moment and what we will be doing continuous programming here on your Arlington Dollar about over the next number of months, you've just explained that an override, if we can the sooner we can do it, the quicker we get to a surplus, as you've said up here, and that money can compound, that money can grow for however much time before we have to start dipping into it.
That's right.
So that's why doing it earlier is going to make that money go further, that amount of money, so therefore it can be a smaller total amount. And as the longer we wait, the bigger that total is going to be.
Exactly right.
And then the other factor that we've talked about on this program before is, as you've just explained, whether that money is meant to last, that override is meant to last for 3 years or 4 years or 5 years. Each one of those calculations will also materially change how much that bill is going to, how much each property owner's taxes is going to be affected.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. And so there we have it. This is the current moment's best guess from a group that includes, as we mentioned at the outset, constituencies from all across the Arlington budget spectrum, and skewing, I don't want to say skewing or erring, but leaning towards the conservative. And this is a mechanism, one of the mechanisms through which Arlington has managed to make its money go further than other towns have been able to do, or than people in this town might have expected over the course of time. So there's bad news coming, because we are looking at red if we don't do anything about it. But within that, the picture looks as good as it can.
Right. I think for us, there's a commitment to transparency, putting these numbers out so people can see them. And so when we make decisions about spending and taxation, we understand the consequences and lay it out like this for everybody to see.
Thank you very much. And that's that. We hope that this has been an illuminating conversation for you, as it has been for us. We thank our Deputy Town Manager, Sandy Pooler, for taking the time to explain some very important information to us. And we welcome you to continue to join us as we explore these issues leading up to what is a likely vote on an override and debt exclusion coming up within the next little while. This is your Arlington Dollar. I'm James Milan for Sandy Pooler. Thank you for being here.